We all remember the 2017-2018 Winnipeg Jets, and the team that should have won it all. A stacked lineup with the likes of prime Blake Wheeler and Mark Scheifele, the freight train Dustin Byfuglien, and of course the young Vezina finalist Connor Hellebuyck manning the crease. It was going all so well until it wasn't, and the Winnipeg Jets were knocked out in the third round that year at the hands of the first-year expansion team, the Vegas Golden Knights. It was an untimely exit, but surely a team with this much talent and this much skill would be right back next season, right? Well, it didn't work out quite like that. This video isn't about the team that Jets fans reminisce about, it's about the team that followed and their attempt to chase the past. For the first time ever since returning from relocation, the Winnipeg Jets had expectations to not only make the playoffs, but to hoist the Stanley Cup. And to be honest, there was no reason to think that they wouldn't be a contender. With all the main core returning, like Patrik Laine, Kyle Connor, Josh Morrissey, and Connor Hellebuyck all another year older, it seemed like the Jets would be a true force in the West. For the first half of the season, the Jets were showing that they had picked up exactly right where they had left off last season. In the first half of the year, they went 26-13-2, and they were one of the top teams in the league, never mind the Western Conference. However, the back half just was not the same. The Jets began to flounder, now sorely missing the center depth and impact that Paul Stastny had brought to the Jets last season, being acquired at the trade deadline. He had walked and gone to Vegas in the offseason. In an attempt to replicate the same impact that Stastny had brought, the Jets traded for the towering center in Kevin Hayes. To that point, Hayes had 14 goals and 28 assists in just 51 games with the Rangers and appeared to be a big get for Winnipeg. Hayes fit in really well, but this didn't move the needle like Kevin Cheveldayoff had imagined. The Jets finished the season with a record of 47-30-5 and fell all the way from first in the Central, where they had a lofty lead, all the way down to third. Something was just not right. Patrik Laine didn't look like Patrik Laine anymore, the scoring depth had completely disappeared, and Coach post-Maurice seemingly had no answer for it, not that he really tried too hard to look for one. The Jets entered the first round of the playoffs and were faced with the St. Louis Blues. The Blues continued their storybook season, knocking Winnipeg out in just 6 games. The Jets were unable to salvage their season, and ultimately it was viewed as a waste of another year. This was supposed to be the year that all the pieces fell into place, but alas, it was a major step back. This was viewed as a Stanley Cup team, and something just went horribly wrong right in the middle of the year. So it only makes sense that post-Maurice got handed a shiny new 3-year contract as a reward. The 2019 offseason was what I like to call the D-pocalypse. The Jets lost 4 out of their top 6 defensemen to free agency or were forced to move on via trade. Ben Chiarot, who proved to be a decent physical defenseman at the time, walked to free agency, along with fellow large man Tyler Myers, who was also a steady top 4 option for the Jets and able to step up into a larger role when needed. That was the least of Winnipeg's problems, however. Jacob Trouba was an RFA and was dealt to the New York Rangers in exchange for Neil Pionk and a first-round pick. This pick was actually Winnipeg's 20th overall pick that they had traded for Kevin Hayes earlier on in the year. This was a move that anyone could have seen coming from a mile away now, as Jacob Trouba had gone to arbitration multiple times, and this was just a long time coming. What no one saw coming was the absence of Dustin Byfuglien at training camp. Big Buff and Kevin Cheveldayoff had multiple conversations and meetings behind closed doors, and it was determined that Byfuglien wouldn't start the season with Winnipeg. Known to no one at the time, Dustin had already played his last game in the NHL. Some believe his reasoning was to leave the game behind to enjoy life with his wife and young children. Some believe that he had left because of disagreements with the organization, and some believe that he just couldn't do it anymore and the rigorous wear and tear on his 34-year-old body had taken a toll. But in the end, we will never know. We will have to wait for the book. 33's contract would be terminated officially in April of 2020. The 2019-2020 season was, for many reasons, one of the strangest years in Jets history. Winnipeg was a sinking ship, and Kevin Cheveldayoff attempted to plug those holes on defense with newly acquired defenseman Neil Pionk and a couple of veterans to fill out the defense core, signing veterans Anthony Bitetto and snaking Lucas Spiza off of waivers. Tucker Pullman also made the jump to a full-time NHLer as well. It was definitely a ragtag group to say the least on the back end. The forward core had remained mostly the same, of course now without Kevin Hayes, but they had also lost Brandon Tanev to free agency, signing a long-term deal with Pittsburgh. Those are 2 pretty big holes to fill, and they filled them with signing the likes of Gabriel Borg, Mark Letestu, and Andrei Chibisov, all of which failed to make any meaningful impact during the season. The Jets did have one significant bright spot, however, and that was Connor Hellebuyck. With the depletion of the defense core, the Jets were going to need him to play at a Vezina caliber form every night if they wanted a shot at making the postseason, and that's exactly what he did. Early on in the year, some players were having eye-catching starts, and it didn't seem so bad for Winnipeg as Brian Little, at the age of 32, appeared to be young again, scoring the game winner in the Heritage Classic and had 5 points in 7 games that year. Another bright spot for Winnipeg was defenseman Ville Heinola. Heinola, who was drafted just a few months ago, began turning heads and scored his first NHL goal and had 5 points in 8 NHL games. Although, disaster would strike down on Brian Little and the Winnipeg Jets, as Nikolai Ehlers' slap shot would hit Brian directly in the ear. Little was helped off the ice, and that fluke accident actually ended up keeping him from ever playing in the NHL ever again. Heinola, while impressing, was just 18. Even with the depleted D-core, it made sense to send him back to Europe to further his development and his game. Those were 2 tough scenarios for the Jets to go through. One, more understandable with the re-signing of Heinola and him being so young, but losing Brian Little, who was a big voice in the room, alongside Dustin Byfuglien right off the bat during the season, that stings. This season was a roller coaster, and it felt like every time that Winnipeg had put together a winning streak, a lengthy losing streak was right on the horizon. Despite that, they managed to stay in the playoff race, that largely due to Connor Hellebuyck, who was routinely facing 40 shots a night. The defense was bad, but so was the system. Post-Maurice and his staff seemingly had no answers for the defensive woes, or they were just ignorant to the fact that their system as a whole just was not working. This plagued the Jets all season long, and the stubbornness to break up the Connor Scheifele-Wheeler line that was notoriously horrific for defensive play didn't help things. While yes, they did bring decent production offensively, it felt like oftentimes they were doing more harm than good. At the trade deadline, staring down a playoff spot, Kevin Cheveldayoff made one of the best trades of his career, landing defenseman Dylan DeMello for the low price of just a 3rd-round pick. With the absence of Kevin Hayes, who did not return to Winnipeg, and Brian Little going down with injury, they brought in local boy Cody Eakin from the Buffalo Sabres. These weren't seen as flashy moves to say the least, but they were improvements nonetheless. DeMello and Eakin fit like a glove, and the Jets had a 4-game winning streak and an impressive amount of momentum heading into Game 72 of the season, but that game would never arrive. A certain virus plagued the world, and the NHL season was postponed for months. When resumed, the NHL had created a play-in tournament in a bubble, similar to what the NBA does with their play-in tournament, and the Jets faced off with the Calgary Flames in the first round. Early in Game 1, Mark Scheifele was the victim of a dangerous and dirty play by Matthew Tkachuk, whose skate blade hit the back of Mark's leg, and his season was over as quickly as he hit the ice. Later on in the game, Mason Appleton and Patrick Laine would also suffer injuries that would keep them out for the series. Winnipeg found themselves in another hole, but this time, even Connor Hellebuyck couldn't drag the Jets out of it. The Jets lost in the best-of-5 play-in series 3-1 to the Calgary Flames and failed to make the playoffs that season. There were a lot of mixed feelings about the 2019-2020 season, many viewing it as a year where the Jets were too depleted on defense to make a legitimate playoff push, bad injury luck, or even just an overall system failure. And to be totally honest, it was just a mix of all 3 of those. Patrick Laine had a rocky season, and despite putting up 63 points in 68 games, he was wildly inconsistent. But the coaching staff and injuries also did not put him in a position to succeed either. Overall, it was just a very frustrating season for Patty, the coaches, and the fans alike. Some bright spots were Neil Pionk, who was great on the power play, putting up a career-high 45 points, Josh Morrissey proving that he can handle playing big minutes night in and night out, looking mostly steady, all while trying to bail out his defense partners a lot of the time. And of course, the man that dragged the Jets to most of their victories that season, Connor Hellebuyck, who was crowned the Vezina Trophy winner that year. The offseason that followed the 2019-2020 season was a whirlwind of underwhelming additions, and spoiler alert, it was foreshadowing for the upcoming year. That offseason, Winnipeg signed Nate Thompson, and after signing a PTO, gave Trevor Lewis a contract. 2 veteran players on the forward core was nice considering how useless the 4th line was a season ago, however, they were not the most impactful. The biggest move that Kevin Cheveldayoff had made that offseason was acquiring Paul Stastny. Years had passed since Stanley had played in Winnipeg, and he was obviously slowing down at this point in his career, however he was still a very good middle 6 forward. Derek Forbort was added to play alongside Neil Pionk, and Logan Stanley was given an opportunity to get his shot in the NHL alongside of Dylan DeMello on the 3rd pair, that just signed a brand new 4-year deal with Winnipeg. Although, with how disappointing Patrick Laine's season was, and suspected tension between him and the coaching staff became more apparent, he was the talk of the town and the NHL. Patty showed up to camp and appeared to be ready for business, as in his first game of the 56-game season, he notched 2 goals and an assist, including the OT winner. Well, with that, I guess you could shut down all the trade rumors, at least for now, right? You would be so wrong. Just 9 days later, Patrik Laine was traded with Jack Roslovic to the Columbus Blue Jackets in exchange for Pierre-Luc Dubois and a 3rd-round pick. This was a blockbuster, containing 2 players that have been drafted right after each other, 2 and 3 overall respectively. Overall, at the time of the trade, it seemed like a pretty fair one. Laine had issues with his usage and problems behind closed doors in Winnipeg, and Pierre-Luc was much more open with his issues with John Tortorella and his coaching style. At the end of the day, this was just a tragedy for Winnipeg, and the whole city felt it. Laine was Winnipeg's first real star since relocating, and supposed to be this generation's Teemu Selanne, and it's a shame that it didn't work out that way. With the season being shortened and COVID running rampant, the NHL rearranged the division so that all the Canadian teams would be in the same division, only playing against Canadian teams. Despite how mediocre of a version that this Jets team was, luckily for them, there was a lot of far worse teams in their division. The Jets were not exactly the most impressive team on the block, but they won their games that they needed to secure the 3rd spot in the North Division. With a 1-2 punch of Mark Scheifele and the newly acquired Pierre-Luc Dubois, you'd think that that would be an extremely productive group down the middle, and that teams would have fits with line matching. In theory, it sounds like a nightmare for other teams, although Dubois was largely unimpressive since the trade to Winnipeg. He posted just 8 goals and 20 points in 41 games, and he even sometimes found himself slipping down in the lineup. Mark Scheifele led the way with 63 points in the 56-game season, while Logan Stanley looked serviceable in what was ultimately a very sheltered role with Dylan DeMello babysitting, and surprise surprise, Connor Hellebuyck once again making the Jets look like a way better team than they were defensively. Those positives are great, but the negatives much outweighed them. Derek Forbort started strong, but he fizzled out by the end of the season, and he was a liability at times. Despite additions to the 4th line, the Jets were basically a 3-line team once again, and Josh Morrissey was dragged down a lot by the laundry list of defense partners such as Nathan Beaulieu, Sami Niku, and Tucker Pullman, who failed to take the next step by the way, and even Jordy Ben, as he was acquired at the trade deadline. None of those players should have ever been near the top pairing to begin with, or even in the lineup at all to be totally honest. The defensive issues were arguably at an all-time high for Winnipeg. The Jets were expected to be stomped by Connor McDavid and the Edmonton Oilers in the first round, many counting them out of even winning a game with how poor their defensive play was that year. And make no mistake, the Jets were getting taken to school. It's just a really good thing that Connor Hellebuyck was there to bail them out when it counted the most. The Jets would win Game 1 4-1 over the Edmonton Oilers, and then Game 2 in a riveting 1-0 overtime contest that saw Paul Stastny scoring the winner. In Game 3, the Jets would be down 4-1 late in the 3rd period, however goals from Matthew Perreault, Blake Wheeler, and Josh Morrissey, with only minutes left on the clock, would tie the game and send this one to overtime. Off the draw in the offensive zone, the puck would come to Nikolai Ehlers, and he would wire it home, ending one of the most exciting and legendary games in Winnipeg Jets history. Despite the Jets being outplayed for most of the series, the Jets had a 3-0 lead heading into Game 4, and that night they would actually end the series in a sweep that no one saw coming. A grueling game where it went to triple overtime, and Kyle Connor finally buried it past Mike Smith, sending Winnipeg to the 2nd round and sweeping the Edmonton Oilers. If you had told anyone that Winnipeg would beat the Oilers in the series a week before, they would have laughed in your face, let alone a sweep. Now with the Jets taking down the Oilers, it seemed like anything was truly possible in this underwhelming North Division. Their next opponent was the Montreal Canadiens, who also had an upset of their own, taking down the Toronto Maple Leafs, who were heavily favored. It seemed like the series would go the distance, but it ended up being much shorter than expected, as the Jets were swept in 4, Winnipeg had fallen as quickly as they had arisen, and this very weird year had ended on a dime. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. According to that definition, post-Maurice and Kevin Cheveldayoff belonged in a mental institution, but Kevin still believed in this core, and for once actually began to look at making some meaningful moves. This was a breath of fresh air, considering his solutions to fix the atrocious D-core was to acquire Jordy Ben and other plugs such as Nathan Beaulieu, and gave him around 20 minutes a night. Chevy went out and acquired Brendan Dillon for the steep price of 2 second-round picks, and Nate Schmidt for a bargain of just a 3rd-rounder because of his contract status. The Jets GM had done it. After a few years of being ripped apart in the defensive zone, he had added 2 legitimate D-men, capable of eating minutes. It seemed like Winnipeg had finally gotten out of their funk, and they were ready to be a team that would be tough to play against. Moving into training camp that year, many people around the league had Winnipeg as one of the teams to watch out for, and for good reason. There was little concern about the offense, and with the defense seemingly patched up with NHL defensemen and not ones that belong in the Swedish Elite League, things were looking up for the Jets, and a Vezina-caliber goaltender doesn't hurt either. Through the first 15 games of the year, the Jets soared out in front as the top team in the West with a 9-3-3 record. Schmidt seemed to be a good fit with Josh Morrissey to start, and Brennan Dillon fit very nicely, rounding out the top four. Just when things finally began to come together for this core, it came crashing back down to earth just as quickly as it took off. The Jets would struggle, and the wins were hard to come by in the month of November and into December. They began to show signs of inconsistency, and the big additions on the back end didn't seem to be making much of a difference. It looked like the same sad sack blue line that was trotted out from the last couple of seasons. It grew increasingly obvious that this had to fall on the shoulders of the man that had been behind the bench since 2014, post-Maurice. There was times in the last couple of seasons where it felt as though Paul's tenure in Winnipeg could be coming to an end, but it never actually materialized despite many players seemingly having a disconnect with him. The team just felt stale. On December 17th, Post-Maurice announced his resignation and stepped down as head coach of the Winnipeg Jets. In his press conference, he claimed that he was feeling like it was a grind to show up to the rink, and ultimately, he felt like the players deserved better than what he was putting out. And Paul was completely right. It was time for change, but this was long overdue. This was a move that should have been made by Jets management at least a season prior, if not sooner. He wasn't even fired, he walked away on his own terms, and that might have been the best decision he ever made in a long time. Maurice is a great human, took over for the Jets in 2014 and elevated them into a real organization, and I think that it's important to recognize that. Paul did a lot for the city, but in the end, it was time to move on. With a record of 13-10-5, and now interim head coach Dave Lowry, it was time to see if the Jets could save their season. Spoiler alert, that did not happen. Post-Maurice may have extracted himself from the bench, but his system and the supporting cast of assistant coaches still remained. Shockingly, the system clearly still wasn't working, and just like Paul, Dave Lowry didn't have an appetite to try new things. The Jets were a middling team with a lot of inconsistency in their game, and it seemed like a lot of players themselves also wanted to walk out the door, just like their former head coach did, with the level of effort that was shown on the ice. It was obvious that once again, even with the reinforcements on the blue line in the offseason, that the Jets just weren't going to be a playoff team. This core had, again, underperformed, and it seemed obvious change was needed, but not to Kevin Cheveldayoff and the Jets brass. They pulled off an absolute fleece on the New York Rangers, sending Andrew Kopp over for 2 second-round picks. One would end up being a conditional first and would end up being Brad Lambert. That also included Morgan Barron and a 5th-round pick. It appeared that the teardown had finally begun in Winnipeg, but that was not the case. Chevy made it very public that Paul Stastny, who was on pace for a 45 to 50-point season on an expiring contract, would not be moved, but probably could have brought back a pretty decent return. They moved a 5th-round pick to acquire Zach Sanford and a 4th-round pick to reacquire Mason Appleton, who they had lost in the expansion draft to Seattle. Only this time, he wasn't scoring 15 goals a season, he was a 4th liner, really struggling to do anything, and just not a very impactful player. The Jets did get rid of Kopp, but despite their playoff chances being slim to none, they decided to spend instead of selling in the end. This was very delusional, and this was a team that failed to show up 9 times out of 10, thinking that they could still make the playoffs. Under Dave Lowry, the Jets would miss the playoffs and they would fire the entire bench besides goaltender coach Wade Flaherty. After Maurice left, the Jets would go 26-22-6, that record being pumped up a bit by the winning streak in the last 4 games of the season, when the games really didn't matter. The season was disappointing, but there were some bright spots. Kyle O'Connor was a menace, putting up a career year with 47 goals and a 93-point season. Pierre-Luc Dubois showed that last season was an outlier. He put up 60 points and he looked like a true leader, maybe even a future captain. And rookie Cole Perfetti showed flashes of his elite vision, putting up 7 points in 18 games before being out for the year. But that was about all the positivity that group had that year. Logan Stanley regressed tremendously from a year ago, many wondering why Ville Heinola, who was ripping it up in the AHL, wasn't getting an opportunity over him, or at least a look for much of the season. The forward core lacked consistent scoring and any type of creativity for that matter. It was a complete disaster, and the exit interviews reflected that. Lots of talk swirled around Mark Scheifele as he stated he needed to evaluate his future in Winnipeg and to do what was best for him, many reading into that as him potentially asking for a trade in the offseason. Paul Stastny was critiquing some of his own teammates' work ethic, and many more players just generally feeling disappointed and frustrated on how the season went. It felt like a waste. Those same feelings whirled around the city of Winnipeg, and in the offseason, it somehow got even worse. That offseason, it became public that Pierre-Luc Dubois didn't see himself as a longtime member of the Winnipeg Jets. This was a major gut punch for the Jets and the city. PLD's agent, Pat Perswan, went on talk shows in Montreal that offseason, making it very clear that he would attempt to get his client back in his hometown, one day that he would be playing in Montreal. Many rumors surrounding Dubois fluttered that summer, many thinking that he would be moved at the draft. But in the end, the biggest news of draft day for Winnipeg was that they drafted Rutger McGroarty at number 14, and with the pick that they acquired from the Rangers, they selected possibly the steal of the draft, Brad Lambert. Dubois would go on to sign his qualifying offer and ultimately wouldn't be moved that offseason. But now, with a one-year contract, the Jets were just kicking this problem down the road. With all that going on, the Jets still did not have a head coach, and for months, they pursued the Manitoba native Barry Trotz. It seemed like a perfect fit, and this was a coach with a history of winning, and winning big. After a lot of back and forth, it came to an end without a contract being signed. Barry wanted to take some time off, and ultimately, Winnipeg had to look for other candidates. They couldn't keep sitting around. After casting a wide net of interviews, including Jim Montgomery, who was hired by the Bruins, and Rick Tocchet, who ultimately ended up at TNT, Winnipeg landed on the recently departed Dallas Stars coach and former Jets 1.0 player Rick Bowness. Bowness was thinking about retirement, but was given a head coaching opportunity in a city that he felt very fond of. He couldn't pass this up. And maybe this wasn't the Jets' first choice, but in the end, Bowness' system with the dedication to structure and defense was a large improvement and something that Winnipeg had desperately needed for years. It didn't hurt either that he was a fantastic human on top of that. This was expected to be the off-season of change, with many big names moving around in the rumor mill like Mark Scheifele, Pierre-Luc Dubois, and even Blake Wheeler. It was painfully quiet outside of the coaching staff being brand new. Small additions such as Saku Maenalainen and other depth pieces were added, but no one coming to set the world on fire. Kevin Cheveldayoff had once again decided to run it back, keeping his core intact and banking on a fresh set of eyes and change his system to take them back to the postseason. But maybe the biggest change of all was that Rick Bowness took the C off of Blake Wheeler. Just like a season ago, the Jets started off hot. Through the first 20 games of the year, Winnipeg had a 13-6-1 record, with noticeable improvement on both ends of the ice. Although, in December and into January, many of the Jets began to drop like flies, with the Jets already missing Nikolai Ehlers since Game 3 of the year, out with a long-term injury. Players such as Blake Wheeler, Cole Perfetti, Mason Appleton, Sam Gagner, and other forwards began to catch the injury bug. The depth chart at forward was grim at times, with guys like Carson Kuhlman, Dominic Toninato, and even Christian Reichel getting some middle six ice time. Everyone expected the Jets to crash and burn, but they actually did the opposite. Winnipeg found ways to win and continue to win. Whether it was Josh Morrissey putting the team on his back in the middle of a career year, Connor Hellebuck saving the day, or just everybody locking it down defensively, they were getting it done. And on January 15th, 2023, the Jets were 29-14-1 and one of the best teams in the Western Conference. While they began to get healthy, strangely, this team began to outright crumble. Between January 15th and March 3rd, the Jets only managed to win 6 games, and the record fell to 35-25-2, going from 1 point being first in the Central to just a couple of months later soaring down the standings and now in danger of falling out of the playoff race. Chevy had to decide if it was going to be time to buy or sell. The Jets still believed that they were a playoff caliber team, but it was clear that they needed reinforcements, with Perfetti now out for the remainder of the season with not a lot of time to go. Winnipeg acquired Nino Niederreiter and Vlad Nemestikov before the deadline, and they were welcome additions and fit very well into the lineup. It also helped that Adam Lowry woke up after not scoring for a very, very long time, almost half of the season, and was one of the top contributors down the stretch for Winnipeg. The feeling was that the Jets didn't do enough at the deadline to have a legit cup contender, and despite their game not improving as much as they'd like it to, the Jets just squeaked into the playoffs as the second wildcard team with a 46-33-3 record. With just sneaking into the playoffs, the Jets would be faced with the Vegas Golden Knights in the first round. The Jets were largely considered underdogs, but after a late season push, it had appeared that they had finally rediscovered their fire that they had had in the first half of the season. In Game 1, Winnipeg came out on a mission. They would dominate the Knights in enemy territory and take Game 1 by the score of 5-1. The vibes were immaculate. Were the Jets back? Could the Jets really take down Vegas? Well, not quite. Just like in the fabled 2018 season, after the Jets took Game 1, the Golden Knights would storm back and win 4 straight, aside from the late comeback in Game 3 to push the game to overtime, where they would eventually lose in double overtime. Winnipeg's effort was largely disappointing, some may even say disgusting. It looked like Dubois had already made his decision and he checked out early. Josh Morrissey, after the season of a lifetime, fell victim to injury, and Connor Hellebuck didn't look like himself, largely because he was completely burnt out after playing basically every game down the stretch for a playoff push. In the end, it was disheartening, but I wouldn't say surprising. Last offseason seemed like it would be the offseason to change, but outside of the coaching staff, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. It was becoming increasingly obvious that this upcoming summer, something had to give. Before the playoffs even came to an end, there was a ton of interest in Pierre-Luc Dubois, and it seemed as though PLD was finally getting his way and that he'd be shipped off to Montreal in no time. Dubois had all the leverage in the situation, or at least that's what many in Montreal had believed anyway, but the Canadiens had a surprise contender in the PLD sweepstakes, the LA Kings. Pat Brisson revealed that Dubois' preference was actually to be playing in LA after all, and that he'd be willing to sign long-term there if the Jets and the Kings were able to work out a deal involving his client. On June 27th, the Winnipeg Jets received an enormous haul for number 80. The trade sent Gabriel Vilardi, Alex Iafallo, and Rasmus Kupari, along with a second-round pick, ironically, that used to belong to the Montreal Canadiens. Hats off to Kevin Cheveldayoff here, as, he really had his back up against the wall, and he turned nothing into a ton, and this was one of the best trades he has ever made in his NHL career. For over a year, it had appeared that the Habs would acquire Dubois for pennies on the dollar, as it seemed like that was the only place that he would be willing to sign long-term and that he was going to force himself there. But in the end, after paying an incredibly steep price, the Kings got their guy and everybody went home happy. Business was not done there, however. As a surprise to few, Blake Wheeler's days in Winnipeg had come to an end. On June 30th, 2023, the Jets would buy out the final year of the 37-year-old's contract, and the former captain would walk to free agency. Many had mixed feelings about number 26, but in the end, no matter how you slice it, Blake Wheeler was one of the greatest Jets 2.0 players, if not the best, of all time. He took the torch from Andrew Ladd and became the face of the Winnipeg Jets. At his peak, he was a machine and a truly elite NHL winger. Since 2011, Wheeler had played in 874 games, scored 255 goals, and tallied 540 assists, all as a Winnipeg Jet. There is no doubt that we will one day see number 26 hanging from the rafters in the Canada Life Centre. And that brings us to where we are today, 5 seasons removed from the glory days that was 2018. The past 5 seasons have been a roller coaster ride. Many things have changed, but something that has stayed the same, however, is Kevin Cheveldayoff's as well as True North's faith in this Jets team to be a consistent playoff team and compete for the Stanley Cup year in and year out. The last 5 seasons leading up to the 23-24 season have had many common themes, such as being afraid of change, making changes too late, and attempting to build a contender through bargain bin additions. None of these themes were a part of the 2017-2018 Winnipeg Jets, and therefore, it's largely why Kevin Cheveldayoff hasn't been able to replicate the 2018 Winnipeg Jets. But will the 23-24 season be any different? The Jets have a deeper forward core than they've had over the last 5 seasons. Their goaltender is a consistent top 5 goalie in the league, and if they can get an upgrade or players stepping up on defense, this could legitimately be a team deep enough to go far in the playoffs. Is this just another Jets team chasing after the good times, destined to be forgotten about, or is this the Jets team that will be remembered as the one that finally ended their quest of chasing the past?